My latest guest preacher on preaching is Colin Adams. Colin is pastor of Greenview Evangelical Church in Glasgow in Scotland, and I've known Colin for a good number of years. I owe Colin an apology because I've had this recording on my computer for many months and only just got round to editing it and uploading it. But I also owe you an apology because you have been missing out on some amazing wisdom and insights from Colin. So I commend this recording to you, and I trust that you'll be blessed as I was in talking to Colin on this subject.
So, Colin, just to begin with, how did you sense God's call on your life for preaching?
Well, I think, John, that for me, the longing for the Bible was there probably before I had a clear sense that I wanted to preach it. So for me, as a teenager particularly, there was a lot of hunger just to study the Bible, to learn, to get into doctrine and understand things more deeply. And then eventually that kind of transposed into a desire to actually teach it. On a ground level, it really happened through the church. So the arm in the back, not so much the arm round the back of encouragement, but more the arm pushing behind, saying, you should, you should, you should. So you should pray publicly. You should share something in the breaking the bread service. You should give a talk to the young people. So through that kind of culture, I was exposed to opportunities to start trying to teach the gospel. And of course, when you start to do that, then you have to go back to the Bible to study it all the more. So I really started to enjoy that. And I suppose as I did that, then I got a lot of encouragement from the church, who were saying to me, look, this is something that we think you can do. Probably by about the age of 17 or 18, I knew at that point that I had an ability to speak, but I also knew enough to realize that I didn't know very much, and therefore that I was quite dangerous. So at that point, I realized that at some stage in my future, I was going to need better equipping, definitely some more in-depth training about how to handle the Bible, how to, going deeper doctrinally. And there was a lot of gaps there for me. I guess my background was not, I didn't grow up in a heavy Bible teaching church that went through books of the Bible systematically or anything like that. So there were big gaps in my knowledge, as well as other things that I'm very grateful to the church that I did know.
Yeah, good. So that's a process started. I think it was 16, 17 as you're going on. Yeah. Okay, good.
Yes, that's right. So probably by the time I was maybe 18, I was starting to preach my first sermon. And yeah, by the time I was maybe 20, I was preaching fairly regularly. So I'm very grateful to the background I had because for all, in other circles, there's many things I admire, but my own background had that openness to sort of throw younger men up there, even if you weren't that wonderful. So I guess that was a great training ground. And I know there's a lot of other younger guys like me that came from that background, even if they've not remained in those kind of churches, churches.
Yeah. So who in those days, but perhaps going on in the years, who were the sort of main influences, the models, the men that shaped you into being basically the preacher you are today?
Well, my grandfather was very significant. He was a lay preacher, I guess, like an old-fashioned gospel evangelistic preacher. And I used to quiz him. He would come round to our house once a week, and I would get about an hour before my mum and dad came home. So I would have the opportunity to kind of ask him, what were you preaching last Sunday? And he was so passionate for Christ, so passionate for the gospel, so passionate for the lost. And actually, he I would say, looking back now, he was someone that loved preaching, So those times were both, I mean, essentially he would preach the whole sermon to me as I sat there, but I would have the opportunity to um, not only quiz him on some of the content, because I was, as I say, I was really trying to grow at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd be asking him all sorts of things about the biblical passage he was looking at. But also it gave me the chance to kind of pull the curtain back a little bit for the first time and see behind the curtain and be able to see, how does the magic work?
Yeah, yeah.
And he would explain a little bit about how he prepared the sermon. So that I would say that stuff was very inspirational. When I moved into my first ministry role, I served under Peter Granger in Charlotte Chapel in Edinburgh. That was a wonderful school of preaching, really. Um, Peter didn't really do formal mentoring, but he did he did two things. One was he preached. I sat under his preaching, which was so formative in itself. And the other thing he did was he included me in his preparation.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I would wander into his office during the week, he would be right in the middle of trying to come up with his introduction or trying to construct his outline or trying to get the application right. And his great kindness, really, to someone who was only like 23 at the time and knew nothing, he would ask for my opinions and my input. And I think that was massively helpful. Peter, I think for me, was such a well-rounded preacher. And as I said to you, I didn't really grow up with many models of. I mean, there were some good preachers there, but not consistently.
Mm-hmm.
So to sit under someone who was kind of just good and solid at everything. Um, so you could learn a lot from the way he introduced. You could learn from his outlines. You could learn from every sermon was well applied to Christians and unbelievers. It was always Christ-centered, whatever you were in the Bible. It was always well concluded. So it was always so well rounded, and also I think part of it was he took on genres of the Bible that I had never really seen preached before.
Mm-hmm.
So he would take on, I don't know, like the book of Jeremiah, and he would preach for 20 odd weeks on it, and he would do things that I thought were impossible. So I think that gave me the courage to preach harder genres.
Mm.
Yeah, there's been lots of other people. I remember John Percival, who was an assistant pastor in the same church and a bit older than me. I remember him giving me a critique of my first sermon at Charlotte Chapel, which he said was okay. It wasn't massively negative, but I always remember him telling me that my introduction was twice as long as it needed to be. And he said, you essentially gave us two introductions. He said, you had us after about your second paragraph, and then you gave us another
Okay.
introduction again. And so things like that I think the things you learn early on stick
Mm-hmm.
with you.
Mm-hmm.
So that taught me something about economy,
Mm-hmm.
about, whether you preach for an hour or whether you preach for 30 minutes, you have to preach with economy. You can't say everything. And so
Yeah.
kind of knowing, when have I said what is sufficient in this section of my sermon is actually
Mm-hmm.
something that is quite important.
Mm-hmm.
Um, just maybe one other thing to mention would be Brian Chappell was very
Mm-hmm.
influential. His book, Christ-Centered Preaching.
Yeah.
I never got a formal sort of homiletics training, never did Cornhill or anything like that. I did do Bible college, but I didn't do homiletics there.
Mm-hmm.
So I was very aware of that when I came out, and um, I was massively helped by that book. I mean, obviously, he taught homiletics for many years, and there's nothing groundbreaking in the book, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just such a helpful outline of the full preparation process. And yeah, I both read the book and also listened to. I think he had 25 1-hour set, lectures, and I think I listened to them twice over. And there was just so much I gained from that. Even just things like, the importance of transitions in sermons. He had
Yeah.
a whole hour talking about transitions, and I didn't even know what those were. But he said, this is why some sermons are unclear, is because people can't transition. They can't
Yes.
transition between their points, their sentences,
Yes.
And so he helped me think through, having a logical flow, which I still think is really important in any
Hmm.
sermon, whatever structure you have or you don't have.
Yeah.
You've got
Yeah.
to have a logical. The train's got to go from station one to station two to state, and it's
Yes.
got to make sense
Yes.
to the listener.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you get lost.
Yeah. 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 And I think linked to that, people need to know that there's a logic to what you're doing.
Yes.
It gives them security and comfort. I had an interesting experience relatively recently. I don't want to give anything away here, but I was sat under ministry, an experienced preacher, but there was absolutely no structure, no logic, no process.
Mm.
And I almost gave up after the first 7 or 8 minutes because
Yes.
I said, this guy, he doesn't know where he's going. He's just,
Mm.
dancing around the spot. And it's interesting as a listener rather than a preacher,
Mm.
realizing how much I needed that structure. Because it not
Mm-hmm.
only made the passage make sense to me, but I convinced myself he didn't actually know what the passage was about,
No,
to be honest with
that's
you.
right.
Uh,
That's right. And I think there are people who, there's someone particularly in my mind right at this moment whose preaching I really enjoy, who he doesn't use an outline with points,
yeah,
1, 2, 3, in really almost any of his sermons, but he's always clear and easy to follow.
yes, yeah,
So it's not. I agree with you about the structure, but
hmm,
it's a structure of logic
I agree.
more than
Yeah,
it's necessarily a structure of points.
yeah,
And so because his sermon follows a kind of an argument and everything unfolds as
yes,
it should.
yeah,
You see that in Paul's writing,
yeah,
don't you? That
yeah,
he
that's
he,
right.
he follows a logical
Hmm.
line.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's probably the strongest thing I've learned as I teach preachers that I wish I'd learned as a student. I mean, I had Sinclair Ferguson for homiletics, for goodness sake,
Oh,
you know. Plus one or two other influences. But the one thing, and I don't want to discredit Sinclair Ferguson anyway at all, but the one thing I don't ever remember being labored about was this idea of structure in whatever way you present it.
yes,
Your sermon has to have
yeah.
a map, as it were, to it, and I just think it's so vitally important. Yeah,
I've also got a bit of a theory that some of the real geniuses of preaching, Sinclair Ferguson would be one of them. There's
yeah,
other people, Alistair Begg, others.
yeah.
On my sabbatical, I was sort of listening to a whole range of people and reading their manuscripts. And it's interesting because I did read some from Sinclair and some from Alistair Begg, both of whose preaching I love.
Mm.
But both of them actually are, they're not the strongest on structure
No,
and
I agree. Yeah,
outline.
yeah, yeah.
But my conclusion coming away from that was it didn't matter for them because they're so exceptional at everything else that
Yes,
they do. And
yes,
so if you're that good at unpacking and explaining ideas, if you're that good at applying in a Christ-centered devotional way, it doesn't matter.
that's
But for
right.
the rest of us mere mortals,
Yeah,
um,
yeah,
we can't get away with that.
that's right.
Um, so yeah, it's
Yeah.
fascinating.
And I think it's also, and those two men in particular, I think, and there are others, but they are what I call the most natural preachers in the world. And I
Hmm.
think when you're as natural a preacher as that, and again, this isn't a negative comment, they actually find it quite hard to explain
Yeah,
how they put the whole thing together. I mean, Sinclair's
yeah,
opening gambit, I've often quoted this, his first line at the first class in homiletics, and I'm going back more than 40 years now, was, I don't know why they've asked me to do this series because I don't know how I preach. And I think he was being genuine. He'd never sat down and analyzed
yeah,
it. It just
yeah.
came. And I think
Hmm.
Begg, I've heard exactly the same set of Alistair Begg talking to a pastor. I don't know how I preach.
Yeah,
Well, I don't
yeah.
care if you know or not. You just do it well, brother. Just keep going. So,
Yes,
uh,
yes, yes.
yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
So, Colin,
Hmm.
um, excuse me. Looking back now, knowing what you know now, what advice would you give your younger self starting out on the road of preaching ministry?
Yeah, I think one of the things I would say to myself now is to not read so much on preaching as I did. So when I started out, for the reasons I've already outlined, I felt I had a major lack in understanding homiletics. So I then plunged myself into all the literature on that. And I would recommend, any younger preacher, I would recommend that you read all the classic
Yes.
books on preaching at least once. Read Jones, read Stott, read Chappell, read all these different Stewart, all these people. Um, I would say they'll read it over a longer period of time than I did. So I think what I did is in my first 5 years, I read like 80% of the books were on preaching. I was kind of obsessed with it. And I think what I would do now is I would do the same again, because preaching is the most important thing you're doing as a pastor. So,
Yeah.
it's right that you give it good attention. But I would do it at a slower pace. And I think the two other areas that I would spend more time reading in is one, biblical theology, which was something that for me I was quite weak on. And I think for practical preaching, it's massively important. You're 4/5 of the Bible's in the Old Testament, so you're
Yeah.
you're spending a lot of your time trying to work out, how do we preach the whole Bible redemptively? How do we preach the whole of the Bible Christ-centeredly?
Yeah.
And even the New Testament, which is not always as straightforward as we think. How do we even get from there to today in a Christ-centered way? So I think I would read more on that. More on the actual books of the Bible, more trying to get biblical knowledge, a real grasp of each of the 66 books of the Bible, which you obviously get over time. I mean, through preaching through books, I've gradually built that up. So I realize you can't completely shortcut that, but I think I would have read more. I mean, a lot of the stuff I'm reading now is biblical theological books. And even if it's not on the book I'm currently working on, I just find that enhanced biblical knowledge just makes me a better preacher, just gives me a more comprehensive knowledge.
Yeah.
The other area I would say are pastoral and cultural issues. So again, that was probably something I underrated. So, reading into stuff on, the kind of BC UK type stuff that folk are reading now, reading into issues that people are struggling with, reading into the contemporary stuff we're all wrestling with at the moment.
Yes.
Reading into the stuff where people are having doubts in the congregation and trying to think some of that through ourselves, so that we're giving people good equipping in our preaching. I think more time reading, not just reading on preaching and getting my biblical theology sorted, but a bit more time thinking about application, really.
Okay.
And I think if I'd read that, and if I'd read a third on preaching, a third on Bible and theology, and a third on kind of ethics and contemporary stuff, I would have been more balanced.
Okay.
And I would say now that's more the kind of balance I would have.
And of course, that helps with the building the bridge, doesn't it, between the
Yes.
Bible and the real world of the people sitting in front of us, as well as us, of course.
Yes,
Making
that's
it
right.
relevant for them. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think another point also is, particularly as a younger preacher, you just know less about the world and about people because you are inexperienced.
Yes.
So one way you can catch up quicker with the fact you're only in your 20s or your 30s and you're not 50 and 60 yet is by reading, And so by reading books where people are reflecting on different experiences and biographies and all these sorts of things, it does help enhance your understanding of people faster.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Makes a lot of sense. I think it was John Stott who used to be part of a sort of book club, and they'd meet once a week and read one of the top 10 books off the national bestseller list to see what
Yes.
people were reading and therefore how they were thinking. And that's an amazingly wise approach.
Yes.
Yeah, it's good.
No, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, there's always balance in that. Of course, we want to read old books as well as new books and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're not preaching in the 19th and 20th century anymore. We're preaching in the 21st century.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
even books like the last year I read the Biblical Critical Theory book that a lot of people were recommending. It's a tome and not an easy read, but part of why I invested some time in that was, here's a guy trying to take the Bible, trying to take all the contemporary issues of right now and somehow put them together. And how does the Bible speak into this and critique this? And Uh, that's the kind of thing I want to read just to help me with my preaching, so that when I'm in a text, I'm starting to think of some of
Yeah,
those
yeah, yeah.
applications.
How do you find the time for all that reading, Colin? That's an issue people often
It's
raise with
difficult.
me, you know.
It's difficult, John. It's difficult. I mean,
Mm.
I read more in my holidays than I do when I'm when when I'm working. I'm not actually joking about that. Um, it's not easy. One of the things is have a target, have a
Yeah,
goal.
yeah.
So I now in my kind of yearly plan where I've got a few other goals I set out. I set out um, the books I want to read. Not even so much the number, but I actually have here's the 12 books I'm going to buy. So I aim to read one a month if I
Okay.
can,
Yeah.
and some of those will be longer, some of those will be really short. So it all evens out
Yeah.
perhaps. And again, I try and read a range of things. So, for example, we're doing a series on Genesis 1 to 12, just about to start it. So, because of that, a few of the books I had on my list running up to this are more about Christianity and science and that kind of thing. So,
Okay.
the reading list somewhat feeds into what I'm preaching on,
Yeah.
but also there'll be other things on there that I'm just thinking, actually, that's a relevant issue at the moment. And I just think as a
Good.
pastor, I need to be reading on that.
Hmm.
So I would say, just have a goal. John Piper helped me a lot with this. Reading reading a little regularly
Yes.
amounts to a lot. I think that's true.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I quite often after dinner, I'll sit down. I'll often have 20 minutes on the couch. Just what am I going to do? Watch a bit of telly. Um, 15 minutes, 20 minutes. It's amazing how that mounts up.
Hmm. Hmm.
And before you know it, you're through a book in maybe the course of a month.
Yeah. 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 I
So
remember that advice from Piper. It was very helpful, very practical. Because
very
it's very
practical.
daunting for some people, the idea, and most
Yeah,
people are not very literate these days, reading it very much at all. Um,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
That's right. And also, if you can get those stretches of time, that is invaluable.
sure,
So,
yeah,
so there's no doubt about it. If you can get time set aside to just read through some longer stuff, it's
yeah.
helpful.
Again, I think it was Stott who had a plan. Is like he would take a half day a week because he's a single
Mhm.
man. That makes a huge difference. But
Yeah,
I think it was like a half day a week he would read,
yeah,
a day a month, a
yeah,
week a year.
yeah,
I mean, it's all right to be that
yeah,
organized if you can do it, but
yeah,
he was saying there's a priority in reading here, and you have to
yeah.
make the time. You won't just find the time to do that. But
No, that's right.
yeah, yeah. Colin, as you survey the preaching scene and engage with it on different levels, what encourages you, what you see in here, and what concerns you?
Hmm. These are that's quite a difficult question, isn't it? Because there's a lot of things, and it's very subjective, isn't it?
Sure, yeah.
You're only seeing it from your own perspective. I think maybe the way to answer this would be there's a double-edged sword. So I think one of the things I'm encouraged by also when you get on the reverse side of the sword can be a problem. So the encouragement is I think there is a real strength in the circles I'm in terms of clarity in preaching. I feel like the clarity of sermons has really gone up
Okay.
um, in the sense that I guess a lot of the influence of um, the sort of the kind of Cornhill, the sort of
Mm.
big idea, the kind of Haddon Robertson type approach from both sides of the pond preaching and Australia. These sort of converging influences have really pushed the importance of preaching a sermon with a message, with a theme from the text, with an application. And so no matter what you're saying underneath that, it's all
Hmm.
supporting the purpose of the
Yes.
sermon and the message. And I think that's something that has got better. I think those kind of dog's breakfast sermons where the guy gets up, says a whole bunch of things, but none of them seem, more important than the other. I hear a lot less of that. But I think it's interesting. Gary Miller, who's the guy who wrote the book Saving Eutychus,
Hmm.
which is
Hmm.
a great title.
Yes.
He 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 teaches preaching in Australia, and he says that his first challenge is getting the people to be clear because when they start, they just regurgitate a commentary in the sermon, and there's no real clarity as to what the sermon's about. He says, so the first problem is I work with them to get them clear. So then the problem is they're clear, but they're boring. So he's got these guys who are repeating the big idea 17 times within 17 minutes.
Yes.
And he's thinking, well, I got it after the fifth time. So I think what he says is right, and a number of people have caught on to this. The need to be imaginative, compelling, passionate, to bring out the color, the detail.
Mm-hmm.
And it's quite hard to do that well, I think, to kind of have a sermon that's clear, but also it sort of puts down some shafts, there's some depth at various places. Again, that was something I thought Peter Granger was very good at. He could stop on sometimes just a word and do a bit of a deep dive on it, and bring out the richness of what was underneath that. And I think sermons need that to be engaging.
Yes.
They can't just be, they must be clear, but they can't be simplistic. They've got to have depth. And it's interesting. I mean, Bob File, known to many people. I mean, he brought out a book last year on preaching. It's almost like a summary of all of his reflections after many years of preaching. And one of the big things he goes in hard on is this very point. He says that there's a lack of imagination in preaching.
Yes.
Now, I'm not sure that he didn't come up with some grand solution. There probably isn't an easy solution, but he was identifying that. And similarly, interestingly, Sinclair Ferguson at I think it was the Catalyst conference last year, he was speaking about the Westminster Directory of Public Worship and what it said about preaching. And he spoke for an hour, essentially. He only really got through the one point, which was, but it was fantastic. But it was the Puritans saying that while the word of God is unchanging, the preacher is a unique individual. And it is truth through personality. And that is often being lost. So how do we ensure that, John Brand faithfully preaches Christ as John Brand, and Colin Adams preaches as Colin Adams?
Yes.
And it's not easy. Sinclair was saying, he can identify where someone is trained often before he even is told.
Yeah.
So how do we do that? So part of it must surely be that we must stop making a certain style the standard.
Yeah.
And that we allow for more cultural diversity, more diversity of personality approach. There's probably more things that can be sacrificed than we think for a sermon still to be faithful. I think quite often our preferences in preaching become the standard of, well, that guy wasn't very good. That was below the bar. So yeah, there's stuff underneath there. I think another thing, John, is also I wonder, particularly some of younger guys I've heard who are fantastic, like way beyond my ability on the text in their 20s, say. They really, I mean, the content is superb. But sometimes I kind of come out of it feeling, oh, it was really dry.
Yes.
And I think part of it is, I wonder if part of it is not understanding what we're actually doing. I think we've got to go back to the first principle. So are we just teaching the Bible? Are we just explaining the gospel? Or are we pastoring people through the Bible?
Yes.
Are we shepherding them from the pulpit with the Bible? Are we evangelizing the lost to see conversion through the Bible? Or are we just teaching and explaining the gospel?
Yeah.
One is very contained, and it's all about getting a 9 or a 10 out of 10 from the kind of the sermon professor. And the other one is a people-focused, pastoral-focused, evangelistic-focused enterprise.
Yeah.
And so I think when you see it in that way, it's not that God's word ever changes, of course, but in a sense that the sermon is ever changing. If I preach even the very same text the following week,
Yeah.
it should be different in
Yeah.
some way because the time's different, the audience is different. It's a moment of preaching, and I do think that I do wonder if something of that's being
Mm-hmm.
lost somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
It could be the age just brings that, John. That might be part of it. Is that
Mm-hmm.
you know it's wonderful that so many people are getting in at a younger stage. So maybe some of that is just um, people in their 40s and 50s are more relaxed in who they are as a person. So I think
Yes.
some of it is maybe is an age factor as well,
Understand. Yeah.
a generational thing. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Because the reminds important is we don't preach in a vacuum.
No.
Preaching isn't an end in itself. I remember as a young guy, I used to say, I'd preach in an empty room. And then I thought, but that's not preaching.
Yes.
Preaching involves people. It's person focus.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I think an old Anglican cleric, oh, I forget his name now, and he said, no, it's one thing to love preaching; it's another thing to love the people to whom we preach.
Yeah.
And that's we have to keep but reminding ourselves of that. I find that
Yeah.
challenging in a more itinerant ministry when you don't know the
Yeah.
people so well. Obviously, it's much easier
Yeah.
when as you preach, you can visualize who's going to be in front of you to a certain
Yeah.
extent.
Yeah.
You could do that if you preach regularly in the same place, but
Yeah.
yeah, I have
There
to
was
know
an
that.
elder in the church I grew up in, a very godly, wise man, and a good preacher himself. And after he had heard me a few times, I remember he came to me, I must have been only like 19, 20, and he said, Colin, don't forget about the people.
Is that right?
And he must have just seen something of that in me that, I
Right.
was so excited about the message and look at
Yes.
this thing I've prepared here. And he could just see that there was a real danger there. So,
Yeah.
yeah, don't forget about the people. That's good
Mhm.
advice.
Good wisdom, isn't it? Good advice. It's great. Colin, one more question to ask you. In the whole process of preaching, from preparation, study, delivery, the whole package,
Mm,
what do you find the most stretching, the most demanding? And has that always been the same, or has it varied as circumstances and
mm.
time has gone by?
Yeah. Oh, there's a number. I mean, I find all of it quite demanding, but I think that the bits that are less automatic. I think some of the stuff is quite, you can just prayerfully, steadily work, and it doesn't take as much really hard graft. But I think that the two bits of the sermon that I find most difficult is the Christ making the connections to Christ, preaching particularly Old Testament texts
Hmm.
redemptively. That will always be quite challenging. Um, and application.
Hmm.
I find
Hmm.
application now on the and they're related, of course. It's Christ-centered application we're trying to do, isn't it? But
Sure.
the other week there, I came across an interesting series of lectures by Christopher Wright. The
Hmm.
guy that writes some of the biblical theology stuff,
Yeah.
and it was interesting because he was asked to do. He's written books on mission
Yes. Yeah.
throughout the whole Bible and everything. So he'd been asked by some seminary in the States to do some seminars on mission in the wisdom literature.
Okay.
Right? So obviously these guys were sort of thinking, okay, well, we get how we get mission from Genesis and Abram,
Yeah.
and we get how we get mission from, right, but how do we get it from Proverbs? How do we get it
Yes.
from Ecclesiastes? How do we get it from Job? And so he gave. I only listened to the first one on Proverbs, which was very good actually. But he was, but in a sense, he was really answering the question of how do we get to Christ
Hmm. Hmm.
from these books. And so that's the kind of thing I do listen to things like that to try and think through. Okay, well, how do I make those steps from Proverbs?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm always working on that, and mainly leaning on people,
Hmm.
learning from people. Um, 99% of the Christ connections I'm not seeing myself. Someone somewhere in a commentary or in a theology book is pointing them out, and I just note those things down in the margin of my Bible.
Hmm.
Um, the application is always challenging, isn't it? Commentaries don't generally help you with that
Yeah.
part,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I think more and more I'm asking the question of myself: is this application legitimate?
Hmm.
I think I'm being tougher on myself than I used to be. and try not to do word association and application, you know.
Yes. Yes.
So there's something on money in this text. So I'm going to just share a few thoughts I have on money now.
Yeah.
Whatever's been bugging me about that one for the last few months, I'll preach that. I'm trying not to do that, and I think David Jackman has a very helpful thing, which he said or wrote somewhere, I don't know, but he says the more specific you can identify the application in the text to the original listeners, the more specific you can get that, the more specific you can apply to today. I think that's very true. So if you can really work out what exactly is Jesus trying to teach about money here, what exactly is Paul trying to teach about giving here, that's different from what Paul teaches in 3 or 4 other passages about money, the tighter you can get that application, the tighter then, you know, you're not then just sort of flying off into 3 or 4 thoughts that you might have, but you're hopefully going down the same line. So that's something I'm trying to do better. It's more of an instinct than a science, though, isn't it? You know, it's and I think that's the bit where you're leaning heavily on the Spirit, and that's the stuff that I'm chronologically it's later in the process anyway, but that's the stuff that I'm still sitting on Sunday morning, rewriting and editing, and because I'm thinking through how does this land with our people, our flock, you know?
Yes. Yeah. And I often find that I want to build it in my preparation also, but I often find that application actually comes in situ, even as I'm preaching. Application ideas come to my mind, which I usually have to trust that is indeed the Lord's prompting. It's not me having a strange inspiration of thought. It doesn't mean I don't want to do it in my preparation, but I also want to allow myself. Sometimes you're looking at people, actually you see their face in front of you. Levels of come to mind, but I think that specificity is massively important, Colin, because we mustn't just what's the moral of this story and then come up with some. It's got to be the application of that passage.
Yes.
And I find it's one of the things that books on preaching are the weakest on. I haven't done it for a few years. I did all the books on preaching I had to my hand, and the sections on application were by far the smallest and the weakest. And there's very few books on application in preaching. Which maybe there's a great one by Michael Faberes. I forget the name. I think it's Preaching That Changes Lives. Something it's called. But there's very few of that genre of book out there that you could.
No, there's not many. There's one by Dan Doriani that I found quite helpful.
Right, yes, yeah.
It's a wee bit of an older one, but I found him quite good. And there's another one by Chris Green that's also quite good.
Yeah, he's good. Yeah,
but you're right. They're not. I take my hat off to these guys trying to write books on. It's not easy to write on because how do you do it? And it can all get quite technical.
Yes.
So I agree with your point about even just being open in the moment. I think that is important. And just to also before the sermon, as many people do, I try and think about different people in the church. And I try and think about different issues. So one of the things that we sometimes talk about as a preaching team is, don't just preach to yourself. Again, it's a classic kind of error, isn't it? But not everyone's married with children and middle-aged and male. And it's my church is slightly over 50% single, for example.
Really? Well,
how much is that factoring in? So it's just trying to think through the different ages and stages. Have I got good application for the older generation? I think that's an often overlooked. If I think of even demographics, I think that's often overlooked. Young people get more of a focus. Also, another thing it would be applying corporately. So I've always had a weakness in applying individualistically. Always had that, which probably tells you something about me. And yet the majority of New Testament application is corporate.
It's true.
So I'm trying to bring that in more. What would it look like for us to apply this as a church? What does this look like in our community rather than just in my own life?
And
I think that's important, and because in a sense, if we're just preaching individualistically all the time, we're actually creating an individualistic mindset. We're saying this is the way you have to read the Bible. It's just stuff about you, for you, rather than actually something that might inform our community life.
Yeah. That's a great point. That corporate application as a church, that's really important. Yeah, brilliant. It's great. Colin, thank you so much. Great. It's great to see you again, talk to you.
Thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.
I must get you. I'm just thinking ahead to, even to January. I'd love to get you to teach a module at EVC on something, a book of the Bible or something like that. That'd be brilliant. Yeah, something like Proverbs. I know you went through Proverbs at one point at your church, didn't you?
Yes, I have. We've done some stuff on that. Yeah.
I'll get you to do Christ and wisdom literature or something like that. Just
Well, it's interesting because part of what Wright said, which I actually found very helpful, was he was saying that a lot of, I mean, obviously there's ways you can get from wisdom to Christ in a very direct way. He is the wisdom of God, but he said, a lot of the key ideas of the gospel are found in proverbial wisdom. A lot of even he says the way that the gospel is described, and say 1 Corinthians, for instance, the way that sinners are described as fools, and so on. And so he points out that although Proverbs is not always directly just giving us a foreshadow of Christ in that way, but it's giving us so much of the ideas, the language, and the framework out of which the gospel comes. The unbeliever is the fool, the one enlightened by the Spirit is the wise man. And so I found some of that really, really helpful. I need to listen to it again because I can hardly remember the detail of that, but it was that kind of thing, and I thought it was helpful without shoehorning. And it shows us the unbeliever and the believer today, essentially.
That's right.
It's almost like the Psalm 1.
Yeah, that's right. It's joining these dots, isn't it? Yeah, massively important. Yeah. Great. Thanks, brother. Really appreciate your time. Lord bless you, John. Work there at Greenview.
Lord bless you. Okay, take care.
Thanks, Colin. And you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.